for me, the concept of goals is often understood in quite a, what you might say, superficial way, in terms of about having targets and about having objectives and about being about, you know, setting something there that you go for, whether it's exercise goals, whether it's New Year's resolutions, or whether it's about weight goals. And I think my background is as an existential psychotherapist. I don't know if anyone was here a while back when I was talking about existential psychotherapy. But for me, existential psychotherapy, and as a humanistic psychotherapist, is very much about I'm having space to explore yourself and to connect with who you are. It's a lot about being rather than doing. It's about trying to get some sense of what it means to be. And from that perspective, goals might be seen as something which is a bit kind of peripheral to our existence, or, you know, at best and at worst, something which becomes about forcing us to be a particular way and having this kind of neoliberal constant striving rather than accepting who we are. But what I want to do today this morning is to try and contextualize the whole notion of goals within a kind of more philosophical frame, really, and talk about goals and embed it in an understanding of human being that is about human agency. Existentialism evolved and developed because it was very much a reaction to models of human being that were mechanistic, that saw people as being determined by their past, or as kind of machine-like entities that there was an input, as in classical behaviorism. There was an input and then there was an output, and that you could understand people as natural science objects. And what existentialism wanted to do is to understand people as choice-making, volitional, active, directional beings who, all of us, all the time, however much we're struggling or however how much we have difficulties in our lives, are acting towards our world. That's not to say that we're not influenced by our world. That's not to say that things in our past, in our childhood traumas, the social and political context around us don't have an important influence. But ultimately, we are beings who respond and act towards things in intelligible, meaningful ways. And the book that I've done recently, this new book on integrating counselling and psychotherapy, is really trying to understand people in that directional sense. And to use it as a basis for thinking about how the different forms of counselling and psychotherapy and behaviour change can come together. And what I'll be talking about this morning is how goals is really one part of that, and is a very useful part of that. But if we only understand goals in the very kind of Stravian, like, you know, this is my goal for today, or this is my goal in terms of achievement, we lose something, and we take a more kind of superficial approach to the whole question. So what I'm going to be doing for this session is going to be a little bit different from, so I'm going to be talking about this idea of directionality as a foundation for goal-oriented practice, inviting you to think about different dimensions of goals and ways in which we can understand goals, because there's some really interesting work, particularly from psychology, about the different kinds of goals that there are, like approach goals and avoidance goals, and what that says about well-being and behaviour change. Then I'm going to talk about using goals in behaviour change work and in psychotherapy, and some important principles that we've learned. So a lot of my research at the moment is around working with goals. We did a very interesting qualitative study with our psychotherapy clients, where we interviewed around 25 clients about working with goals in therapy. What did they like? What didn't they like? Where was it helpful? Where wasn't it helpful? And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. And also something about kind of using forms, measures, something that we've developed called the goals form, as a way of facilitating and promoting behaviour change around goals. The format's going to be a little bit different. Rather than talking to you with a break for an hour and 3/4 or so, I'm going to be kind of stopping at various points and inviting you to do some exercises just to make it more meaningful in terms of your own personal experiences and personal goals. I'm going to be inviting you to talk to other people, and including people you don't know. So if people could bear in mind confidentiality, and that if somebody shares something with you, if you could just keep it within that context and not share anything that somebody else said to you to someone else. Everyone okay with that? Just to make it safer for everybody, feel like you can talk about things. And of course, don't do anything that you don't want to. But I would encourage you to, we can talk about the theory of goals and the theory of directionality, but it's going to make a lot more sense if you actually think about it in relation to your own life. So I would invite you to take part in things, but obviously if you don't want to, that's absolutely fine. Just to talk then a little bit about what goals are. Here are some of the definitions of goals. Subjectively desirable states of affair that the individual intends to attain through action. A cognitive representation of a future object that an organism is committed to approach or avoid. Or internal representations of desired states. That's the one that's used most often in the literature. A goal is an inner representation of something that we desire. And you can see in those definitions a few things that are characteristic of how we define goals and how we think about goals. So goals are firstly, they're mental representations. They're things in our head that we imagine, that they have a strong cognitive element rather than being actual things out there in the world. They're future orientated, and that's very important, that goals, because when we understand people in terms of their goals, and where people are going for, it means that we start to think about people in terms of where they're going and where they're moving towards, rather than perhaps where they've come or what's happened to them per se. Although goals are mental representations, they're what we might call hot cognitions, in the sense that a goal is something that matters to us. It's not just a neutral belief about something, it's something that we want, something that we often have emotions about, and there's various theories about how our emotions are very much related to our goals and our directions. I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But they clearly have that affective component. And that's one of the nice things actually about goals, is they kind of link the cognitive realm and the affective realm, because they are beliefs, but they're beliefs that have some element of importance. And also goals, if we compare something like a goal against, say, a hope or a wish, that goals are something that we expect ourselves to do. A goal is something that we set for ourselves. You know, I might hope my daughter gets accepted. She's trying to get into RADA at the moment. That would be one of my hopes, that she gets into RADA. But I wouldn't really say that that's a goal. It might be a goal for her, but when we think about it as a goal for her, it's in the sense that she's got to go through the auditions and try and do her best. But I wouldn't say it's a goal for myself, because there's not really much that I can do about it apart from have to pay for it at the other end, which I guess my goal would be having enough money to, if she ever gets in, to pay for it. Okay, so that's what goals are. So goals are these kind of representations we have of the future that we would like, that matter to us. Now, what I'd like to invite you to do is, can you just get a piece of paper or a pad or something where you can write down something? And I would just like you to jot down maybe 3, 4, 5 goals in each of the following domains. So firstly around work, around finance, around kind of employment. Just first things that come into your head. Try and get ones that are important to you, but just jot down 3 or so goals around work or finance. Okay, that's one area. What about relationships? Partners, family, friendships. These are the main areas that people talk about when they think about goals and invite people to think about goals. 3 to 5 goals about your relationships. Okay, and then let's do, again, 3 to 5 about self, mental health, spiritual, emotional well-being, personal development, those kind of areas. And then also, if you have any in other areas, so just think about what your main goals are in life. Maybe they don't fit into those 3 areas of work, relationship, self. If there's anything else, maybe sport, traveling might be a goal for you. An important goal. Try and write down, if you, as you look at that list, think about, is there other things that you want for your future that aren't down there, and just check that they're down there. The most important goals for you in your life at the moment. A lot of the kind of psychological or psychotherapeutic ways of inviting people to think about goals kind of start by inviting people just to brainstorm a little bit about goals in different areas, so that gives people a bit of scope rather than just saying, what are your goals? Okay, and what I'd like you to do now is just choose 3 of those goals that are kind of, for you, are the kind of highest priority right now, that feel most important right now. Just choose which 3 of those ones you've written down feel the most important, that really resonate with you and have that sense of mattering. Okay, and what I'd like you to do, I'd like to just invite you to just share those with someone near to you. Could you find someone near to you who you don't know? Somebody new, if you can, and just, sorry, that wasn't the task in itself, that was just the beginning. If you could find that person and just take a few minutes each just to share what you wrote as your 3 main goals and why. Okay? So why did you choose those goals? I'm sorry we don't have more time to explore some of these questions, because I think exploring it and thinking about, what do these things mean for yourself is such a useful way into understanding this. But we'll just park this for a little bit. We will come back to this, thinking about your goals and thinking about what are the most important kind of objectives for you in your life. But I wanted to just talk a bit about it in terms of kind of deepen it, take a step back and just think about it more in terms of understanding and what we might call an ontological understanding. Ontological means kind of understanding the nature of being in our goals. Because as I was saying at the beginning, that we can understand goals as one expression, one manifestation of something about what it means to be deeply human. That although we may not always express things in terms of goals or objectives in such a kind of explicit way, that as human beings we are fundamentally goal-orientated, or what in some of my writings more recently I've been talking about this idea of directional, that as human beings we are fundamentally directional. Martin Buber, who's an existential philosopher and a relational existential philosopher, talks about this term directions has been used, and it's quite difficult to find quite the right term to describe this kind of human quality of agency or activity. We might talk about people as being fundamentally motivated or fundamentally intentional. But directional is quite a nice term that has a kind of sense of just the way that we're oriented, that as human beings we're always oriented towards something, always moving in a particular direction. Martin Buber talks about directions as that primal tension of a human soul, which moves it to choose and realise this and no other out of the infinity of possibilities. The way that as we move in the world, as human beings, we're moving towards different possibilities, different choices, and our sense of those directions, whether they come from the outside world that lead us in particular ways, or whether it's something that is our kind of, some Buber would believe that we're all born with particular directions in life. Maybe it's things that we kind of choose. Some of the other existential philosophers would say that it's more that they're choices that we make. But from all these different perspectives, the idea is that we are acting towards our worlds. And that, for instance, being here at the Weekend University, we're here because we want to do something, we want to achieve something. In the work that you do, it's about maybe because you want to develop and grow. Maybe it's because you need to earn money to be able to do other things. In the relationships that you're in, it's about moving towards some, maybe not explicit goals, but moving towards something. And that thing that we're moving towards, our directions, are always in the back or maybe sometimes the forefront of our minds. But even if they're not in the forefront necessarily, they're always there, present in our being at what we call an ontological level, in the sense that they are intrinsic and integral to our being, those different directions. So being as direction means that we're always on the way to somewhere, that we're always moving, we're always trying to reach something. Even if what we're trying to reach is a state of being or a state of mindfulness, that we're always in a sense trying to move forward and move on to something. And it means that being is kind of teleological, and there's lots of different theories going back to Aristotle about this idea that being is future oriented. It's not to say, as I was saying before, that the past isn't important and that the past can't really influence us. But it's about understanding people then as not just caused by the past, like kind of billiard balls where a billiard ball from the past hits us and then we just ricochet off in different directions. But actually that all of the times we're acting towards the future. That may be very much informed by what we've experienced in the past. So as a psychotherapist, for instance, I might work with clients who've been sexually abused. And because they've been sexually abused, that means they're incredibly cautious about relationships. Close relationships might be one particular consequence, because they're afraid that if they get close to someone, that they will be really hurt and betrayed and really let down. Now, clearly there, the past has a really strong influence. But from a teleological perspective, we're not saying that the person is just caused to be afraid of relations because of what happened in the past, and that this person is like this machine where A causes B and that leads to C. But rather, what we have is an intelligible, intelligent, thoughtful person, which is certainly what I, as a therapist, I'm working with all the time, who is trying to do the best for their future. He's trying to think, I want to feel safe in my future. And maybe that's not a conscious thought, but has that direction, like many of us do, towards safety, and thinks, if I want to feel safe in my future, then I need to avoid relationships. So that avoidance of relationships is not some kind of dysfunctional pathology that's been caused and eroded into that person's brain, but more based on those memories and those very difficult experiences as an intelligible choice towards the future. And as a therapist, that's where I and most therapists, I think, would want to start from. So being as directional means that people are agentic. It means that people are acting towards their circumstances. Of course, it doesn't mean that people are completely free. All the time in our worlds, we face certain restrictions. As someone who's imprisoned, and Viktor Frankl, the existential therapist, writes about this a lot, about people who, for instance, in the most ghastly of imprisoning situations like Auschwitz. But he also writes about, in a situation like Auschwitz, somebody can't choose just to escape that situation. But faced with those boundaries, there are still choices that people make in the face of the circumstances. We might say that a rat is in a cage, but a rat is not the same as the cage. A rat doesn't become the machine around them, that people are not machines. That even when we face restrictions in our lives, and we all have different restrictions in our lives, we are always acting towards those restrictions and trying to do the best often in those circumstances. So directional also means intelligible. There's a reason, and it's really the basis for psychotherapy. There's a reason for why we do the things that we do. From the outside and from a kind of diagnostic and from different perspectives, we might take the client who's avoiding closeness and say, this is a symptom of borderline personality, or this is avoidant personality. But when we look at people in a more directional sense, what we're looking for is the intelligibility and the reasons why people are moving in particular directions, and understanding people as always moving in particular directions for reasons. So when we take someone who, for instance, has got a drink problem, rather than thinking about that as being caused by a past experience or being caused by some kind of biological disorder, those things may be important and they may influence them, but we still see somebody there who is trying to act towards their circumstances, maybe that their lives are so painful, that reality is so painful that alcohol becomes a way of trying to cope with it, trying to drown out these really difficult feelings, that there's an intelligibility there. Doesn't mean, of course, that intelligibility is different from saying that where we go is always the best way for us. And one of the things I want to argue this morning is that, although we might understand people as directional and intelligible, sometimes the directions that we form for ourselves aren't the ones that are most helpful for us. And we can try and understand which are more or less helpful, but that doesn't mean that they're not there for a reason. So when we talk about directionality, we're talking about something that is both conscious and unconscious. It's not just our conscious goals, and that's why directionality is a deeper concept than goals alone, because goals tend to be the kind of conscious things that we set for ourselves. But directionality is also those very deep embodied feelings that lead us in particular directions, that desire for closeness, that Somebody who's maybe been very abandoned as a child may have that kind of deep need to be loved and liked, to be approved of by others. And all the time in our bodies, the directionality of our body is taking us, or we are taking ourselves, or our body is leading in particular ways. And of course, sometimes those conscious, those cognitive directions are pulling in very different directions from the embodied unconscious directions that we have. I sometimes think about directionality as like a river, and the delta of a river. There's not one direction that we have, that often branches off into multiple different streams and multiple different directions. And sometimes those are quite confluent and they can go and work quite well together, but sometimes they're clashing and that they're running up against each other. And what I'll talk about later is the way that if we understand people as directional in terms of their goals and the movements that they're making, then we can understand psychological problems often as the conflicts that happen where one part of us is pulling in a very different direction from another part. And often those conflicts are between the conscious and the unconscious, the cognitive and the embodied. But directionality is also in the world. If you look at your goals, some of them are about self, some of them are about personal development, but they're not inward-looking things. Our goals, our being in a directional sense, is always towards the world. It's a flow outwards rather than a flow inwards. And that's very important because also when we understand, and I'll talk about later, that we can understand psychological well-being as the capacity to actualize our directions, that when we're in a good space in the world, it's a flow of being able to move towards the things that we want, to be able to move towards these goals. And sometimes the reason that we can't do it is because the way we've set up our lives is such that our directions are really pulling against each other, or that we just don't have the right strategies in place to actualize our directions. But sometimes the reason that we don't actualize our directions is because of the world that we inhabit. Somebody might have a direction towards safety. It might be very important for them to be safe and not to experience threat all the time. But if they're, say, an asylum seeker who's come to this country, is facing prejudice and racism, then that may make it very difficult for them to actualize that direction. Not because of what they're doing, but because of the world that we inhabit. And we know from the evidence very much that people's achievement of their goals is not just about them. It's also very much about the world in which we inhabit and the kind of social and political restrictions that have enormous impact on people's well-being. One way of understanding directionality, to go into it in a bit more detail, is to think about the kind of different phases. So far I've been talking about directionality as a kind of stream that moves us forward. But we can also think about the different phases, the different kind of stages of that directional flow. And there's different models that we have in psychology. There's stages of change is probably the most familiar one, by Prochaska, De Clementis and Norcross, which talks about things like action, and talk to things about like preparation and pre-preparation and getting ready for different stages. And that can help us think. And where understanding things in terms of phases is particularly useful is then we can understand, as I said at the beginning, that we can think about goals as one element of that directional process. And then when we think about the different phases of directionality, that becomes a little bit clearer. So I just want to give you a little model. When we think about our directions and where they come from and how they evolve, we can think about, to begin with, that process begins with a kind of an emergence that, initially we don't maybe have a kind of cognitive, I want to do that, but there's something in our body. Maybe it's a yearning for closeness or a yearning for intimacy. Maybe it's a uncomfortable feeling about feeling put down by somebody that tells us that what we want is self-worth. Maybe it's that anxiety that tells us that we have a direction towards safety and towards security. And that emergence of directions is often at a very unconscious level, at that embodied level that I was talking about earlier. And then there's the possibility for awareness, that we can become aware of these directions. None of these phases, though, are essential. So we may have a kind of a desire for relationality, a desire for closeness, a desire in the morning to be, snuggled up in bed with a partner. And that might be something that we're very aware of. And we recognize it and we can think about that. Or we might recognize in a situation that we feel very ashamed maybe somebody says something that makes us feel put down and we feel ashamed, and we can recognize that we have a desire to kind of assert ourselves and stand up against it. But sometimes also that we don't. When I was working first as a counsellor, I was working with a lot of men who were perpetrators of domestic violence. And when I talked to them and when they talked about their experiences, what became clear is that a lot of the violence came for them from a place of feeling shamed, feeling powerless, and that, but often they weren't aware of those feelings because of the kind of nature of, I guess, what you call toxic masculinity these days, recognizing that shame. And so they were acting out in in incredibly destructive ways, rather than being able to recognize and acknowledge some of the feelings and some of the desires that were there. And often the desire was, although it was incredibly destructive, I think my sense in the work was often the desire was maybe partly for power, but often it was more about self-worth and feeling that was so undermined, feeling and experiencing but there wasn't that kind of awareness. So we have kind of emergence and we have awareness. And then we have the possibility for evaluation to kind of think about, what do I want to do with this direction? Is it something that's important for me? Being able to weigh up different directions and to think about how I want to move forward. And awareness clearly helps that. If somebody can be aware of those directions and those emerging directions, it allows them to evaluate more carefully. Is this a road that I want to go down? Do I want to go down this path? Without it, that might become a more kind of just a more spontaneous process where somebody moves into intention and saying, right, I'm going to do this. Once somebody has an intention of saying, right, I want to do this, I want to make this change, I want to start having things happening in my life, that's where we can start talking about goals. Up to this point, we're really talking more about desires and wishes and wants. But here, we start to think about goals. So there's that stage of intention, if you like, that kind of moment of choice where we say, it's not just that I feel this desire for relatedness or I want closeness with people, I want to feel self-esteem, that we have an intention to make something happen. And sometimes, again, that can be a very conscious process, or that can happen very automatically. If it's conscious, there's more likely that we can go into a phase of planning, actually thinking, how am I going to make these intentions happen? And that can be a really important phase. And generally, all these phases have a kind of important role because we may have an intention to make something happen, but if we don't plan it and actually think, how am I going to make, for instance, the goals that you've written down there happen, it can be much more difficult to actually actualize it. And then, of course, we have the phase of action where we're doing things. And although that phase of action is just one of these different phases, that in reality, that might be the main phase, that may be taking up most of our time, is actually putting these things into action and using feedback as part of that process to actually thinking, is this action successful? And then we end in termination. As I was saying, I think one of the useful things about this model, and this is a kind of a conglomeration of different ways of thinking about it, and there's different models, and as I say, it's called a kind of art because we can think about this as a cycle, and of course it doesn't happen this, then that, and that, and that. But it does help us think about things like, what's the difference between a goal and a wish, a goal and a desire? Because when we think about goals, as I was saying before, we're particularly thinking about those things that are after that stage of intention. When we have a goal, it means, as we saw in those definitions, that there's a commitment to action. We want to make something happen. But before that, we've got that whole phase of desires and wants and wishes. And many of those desires and wants and wishes never actually translate into active goals. They may stay as desires and wants and wishes. But when we see it like that, what we can also see is why sometimes just focusing on goals can be a bit superficial. Because we're really focusing more on those things that are past that intention phase, where there's a kind of conscious, at some level, decision to pursue something. But what it ignores is all the things, all the directions, all that embodied directionality that's going on here, which is about those things that we may deeply want, but that never get translated into active, conscious deliberate intentions, the kind of goals that we can write down on a form and then be able to work on. And often without that, just to fulfill these goals, to actualize these goals, without connecting to these directions can be a very empty life. To be just doing the conscious ones. We need these unconscious ones because often these are the deeper ones. These are the ones that are most fundamentally important to us, and I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the also useful things about this model is it can help us think about how the different therapies come together. So for instance, psychodynamic and humanistic therapies, for those of you who know a bit about the therapy world, where clients have space to really talk and explore their emotions, are great approaches to help clients think about their desires and their wants, what's going on for me, to have the space to really reflect on what is it that I want at a deep level without having to worry too much about planning and action. And then we have the existential therapies, and if you were here before when I was talking about existentialism, existentialism is a great therapy to think about intentions and choices. And it kind of starts here, and it starts by saying, what are the choices that you are making in your life? And rather than kind of necessarily going back and looking for those deeper desires, it starts by saying, our lives are the ones that we intend, and we have freedom at this moment of intentions about how we go forward. But then you have the cognitive behavioural therapies, and what they're great at is helping people to think about things like planning. So that you might be working with a client and actually saying, okay, so you have a goal to form more friendships. What are you going to do? How are you going to plan that? What are you going to do if something goes wrong? And then you have other therapies like the behavioural, specifically behavioural therapies, where you're really with people in the action phase. Rather than thinking with clients about do I want to get over my anxieties, you're saying, right, you've got a fear of heights, let's go with you to a tall building and stand and have a look over and let's do it, let's see what it's like, let's help you actually take those steps in action to make changes and to actualize that direction, which is maybe to have more freedom in your life because you're not restricted by these fears. So when we think about directionality in this way, we can see that all these different approaches to behaviour change actually have their place. It doesn't make sense to be arguing about is a behavioural approach more helpful than a psychodynamic approach or a humanistic approach, because it really depends where clients are at and what clients want. If a client really knows what they want and has a clear sense of it, like I just want to be happier in my life or I want to get over my anxiety, a cognitive behavioural approach that can help them plan that, put that into action can be really useful. But if you're working with a client who's saying, I don't know what I want in my life, I don't know where I am, I don't know where I'm trying to get to, then working in a more reflective way and helping that person think about what's really important for me, what are those directions that I want to be actualizing in the first place, may be a more useful way of thinking about their lives and where they want to go and actualizing those directions. The other thing that can be quite useful about this is also thinking about, if you think about yourselves and your own lives, is thinking, when you look at that, you might want to think, okay, what of these phases am I good at? And where are my weaknesses? What are these areas that I'm not so strong in? Because the kind of model suggests that we need to do all of these things to a certain extent to be able to really flourish and to be able to move in the deepest directions that we want to, not just in terms of kind of more superficial goals, but to be able to actualize our deepest directions. So for instance, this is me, right? I tend towards the impulsive. I'm pretty good at emergence, I can lots of ideas and I'm fairly in touch with myself so that things can emerge and I can be pretty aware of that. But then when it gets to evaluation, I just find that really boring. Just thinking about weighing stuff up. Those where people write the pros and the cons. Oh, fuck that. It's so boring. I would much rather just leap into something. Like with a holiday, like with my wife, she will sit and she'll plan and think about all the plans. I'd much rather go somewhere and just see what it's like and then try and adjust once I get there rather than doing that evaluation. Yeah, and planning is absolutely the same. I hate planning. I really hate planning. But if I think about my life and I think about some of the problems I've hit in my life, often it's because I just tend to skip those phases. I'm much more interested in starting off initial action, getting into action, using feedback. I'm pretty good at using feedback, getting to the end of stuff. But there's something really missing here for me around planning and just evaluating and just thinking about how can I do this in a kind of best way. So I throw myself into things. Sometimes it works out, but it's pretty random, and sometimes it just doesn't work out very well. The other kind of, the opposite end of that, and I'm sure there's multiple variations of this, is where there's just this kind of paralysis by analysis, which is somewhere where the things are really slow and somebody really spends a lot of time. You know, I live down in Brighton, this is the kind of Brighton model of things, where you just, well, I'm just going to take it easy and just chill out and do some guitar for a bit and just think about where I'm at and evaluate it and maybe, this is a big barrier about kind of intention, and then, lots of planning, and, by the time you get to action, you're kind of dead really, because you never get to there. And that's a problematic pattern as well, in the sense of, that there's so much of the preparation. And I think there's something about being able to get to that balance of being able to do these things, each of them to some extent well, is probably something about having a good balanced life. What I was talking about then was a kind of phase model, and there's different ways. I mean, something else that's nice about the concept of directionality, and just say that what I'm talking about is what's in my new book. I think it's out next week actually. It's exciting. Just got that in. It's very exciting, very good book. But yeah, so it's that's one way of looking at it, and then and some people have talked about it that way. But then there's another way, and again, a lot of psychologists have kind of looked at it in a different, and it's very compatible sense, a kind of structural sense, which I think. And when I was writing the book, actually, I was kind of moving between the two, and there's probably more working out about how they go together. But it's another, I think, very useful way of thinking about this idea of directionality. So what a lot of people would say, and there's people like Bill Powers in the States who's written a lot about this, and it's very kind of well-established psychological models, and I think it's implicit in a lot of the ideas that we have. Again, it's not kind of earth-shattering, but it's a nice framework. It's this idea that when we think about directionality, we can think about it in a kind of hierarchical structure, from highest order directions down to lower order directions. And in some ways, it's kind of turning that phase model 90 degrees clockwise, so that whereas we were talking before about kind of the emergence of directions, we can think about those as perhaps the higher order directions. And when we're talking about this hierarchical model, we're talking about the idea that the higher order directions are kind of the ones that we do the other directions for. They're the ultimate reasons, there are most important, most kind of fundamental goals, desires, hopes, wishes. So things, for instance, like relatedness might be the thing that we most fundamentally want in our lives. And I'll come on to that in a sec. And then, of course, there's different ways that we can do that. So as we go up, we're talking about the why we're doing things. As we go down, we're talking about how we do certain things. So, if I want relatedness in my life, it might be through a romantic relationship, it might be through closeness with friends, it might be through time with children, and then, I might have different kids and I spend time with them, and with one of my children, and there might be different things that I do. And we can kind of, Bill Powers, who particularly developed this model, had about 11 different levels, from the kind of most basic kind of proprioceptive hand movements that are kind of directions to achieve something, that move up to these kind of higher level goals, the kind of most fundamental directions. One of the interesting things about this model then is it raises the question like, what are the most fundamental directions in life? And in a way, all the different therapeutic theories have been asking that question, and all have different answers. So you take, for instance, a Freudian model, which is mainly around pleasure. You take the person-centered or the humanistic model, which is more around growth. There is some kind of cohesion between the different models. So a lot of them talk about pleasure, whether it's psychoanalytic or some of the kind of cognitive behavioural ideas. People like Richard Layard's written a lot about happiness, and the idea that ultimately where we're trying to get to, the kind of the top of the tree, is about pleasure and about happiness, and that we're all striving for pleasure, and that when we want things like relatedness, or closeness, or food, or sleep, all is ultimately about trying to achieve that highest order direction of pleasure. But then other people talk about other things. So Rogers very famously, Carl Rogers in the humanistic potential moment, actually said, no, it's not just about pleasure, but actually often what we want is growth, and actually growth is more important. The actualization of ourselves, of our potentiality, is the highest order direction. That pleasure can serve a part in that, but actually growth is a higher order direction than pleasure. More recently, there's been some very well-founded theories around one called self-determination theory that talk about these higher order goals. And self-determination theory, if you come across it, if you're interested in humanistic psychology, is a very important model, and they're very evidence-based, but also very humanistic. And they talk about three fundamental highest order directions. So one is autonomy, about the need for freedom, and the need to not feel restricted. And then the next one is competence, about self-worth and feeling good about ourselves. And then the third one is relatedness. And a lot of people, I think, now kind of accept that as a useful framework for thinking about what is it that our clients and people tend to want. And it goes across lots of different situations. I think it's a very helpful model, this idea of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. But there's other ones that we can think about. Probably safety is a really important one. And Maslow, for instance, in his hierarchy of needs, talks about safety as a very important higher order goal. Now, this is different from Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the sense that the point there was to say that we need one before we get the other, and then we can strive for another. And we're not getting into that here, but when we think about this idea of a hierarchy of directions, it raises this question about what are the most fundamental things that people want. There's other models, for instance, saying that it's probably very different for different people. Do we have to have a universal theory about what is the highest or the highest order directions? That maybe for some people the most important thing is pleasure and autonomy, and for other people it's relatedness. Probably as a therapist, at the end of the day, that's the most important position to have, because if I have a client coming in and they say to me that, for me the most important thing in my life is faith, and that's my highest order kind of goal in life, I'm not going to start saying to them, well, you think it's faith, but really it's about pleasure, or, you want really relating. I mean, it wouldn't be relevant. And interestingly, there's a wonderful philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who's a pluralistic philosopher, which is another area that I've been very interested in, who says that part of a democracy and part of living in democracy means that we allow people to have their own highest order directions as long as they're not hurting others. That we don't say to people, everybody should have this, or everybody should strive for pleasure. And that's probably, one of the arguments in the therapy world at the moment is about, should we have one main therapy, or are there lots of different options that should be available? And if we say that people have different highest order directions, then some therapies, for instance, humanistic therapy, maybe is more suited to growth, CBT is more suited towards pleasure. That there needs to be different therapies available because people have different things that they fundamentally want. But going back to the notion of directionality, what we can say then, and this hierarchical model, is that when we're talking about well-being, we're not just talking about achieving goals, and that's why, the things like when we think about SMART goals isn't enough to be thinking about how people achieve well-being, because it's not just about achieving goals per se. I think what we can say is that well-being is about actualising our highest order directions. It's not just about getting on the internet. I might have a direction. I've got to find out what the Wi-Fi password is here, but that's not in itself going to bring me fulfilment and well-being in my life. It's about those highest order directions and being able to have the relatedness that I want in my life. If I can actualise that relatedness, and if I can actualise that sense of competence and self-worth, and that sense of safety in my life, and that sense of growth, and all these things I would say are important to me, particularly relatedness, then that's where well-being is. And concomitantly, the other side of that is that psychological distress is where we struggle to actualise these higher order directions in our life, where we don't feel safe, or we don't experience relatedness, we experience isolation, or pleasure, or if I'm a very religious person, I have a crisis of faith and I can't actualise that desire for faith. that well-being is something about actualising those highest order, most fundamental directions. And when we talk about actualising, also very importantly, we're partly talking about achieving, we're partly talking about having that growth or having that pleasure. But what the research shows is that it's not just about the achievement of these things. You know, it's not just about getting to the destination, it's also about the journey. We know, for instance, that people have higher well-being if they have a sense of direction, just knowing what's important to us, knowing that and this is where the meaning-oriented therapist, Joel Voss, who will be talking, I think, later in the year here, write a lot about the importance of having a sense of meaning. Where is it that I want to go? Seems to be very important. Without that, we can feel very lost. And then also around having a sense that our goals are attainable. We know from the research that people who feel that they can attain their goals have, again, higher well-being than people who feel that their goals are never going to be able to be reached. And often with clients, there's a sense of, I'm never going to get to where I want to be, and that can be a real struggle. And then approaching. You know, research shows that if we feel that we're approaching our goals at a pace that feels good to us, not too slow, then that is very strongly associated with well-being. And finally, also, I think is really important, is about appreciating. You know, 5 A's, appreciating. Not just kind of going from one goal to another, actualising one direction and going on to the next direction, but actually being able to take the time to really think about what it is that we've achieved, what it is that we've done, and being able to take some satisfaction in that and having that sense of meaning. So for me, when we're talking about actualising our directions as a well-being, it's all that different processes, but it's being in that flow of being, in that movement towards our directions. And I know for myself that that's when I feel good, is when I've got things that I'm striving for and I feel like I'm moving towards it and I feel like I get there and I can take a bit of time to have a drink and think, yeah, that's great. You know, I've done really well there. And that I can then start to think about the next thing. And of course that's not there all the time, and sometimes I feel frustrated and sometimes I don't feel that I'm approaching my goals or things don't feel attainable. But generally, if we can have that in our life, that flow in our life, then things can feel pretty good. But what that raises then is a really fundamental question. It's like, if people are basically directional, and if well-being is around actualising our directions, then why is it that people don't actualise their directions? Why is it that people get stuck? Why is it that people can't experience that well-being that we're kind of set up and should be able to achieve? And what I want to talk about is 2 kind of main mechanisms, and we're going to talk mainly about the kind of psychological mechanisms rather than the social and the cultural and the political ones. But as I said earlier, I think those are really important as part of the frame of here, is that, you know, one of the reasons we don't actualise our directions maybe because of the political, the social landscape that we live in that makes that very difficult for us. But I won't talk about that today. If you look at the different models of psychological theories, they talk pretty much about 2 main processes across them, different languages, different frameworks, but there's 2 main things that they talk about. The first one is that sometimes the reason that we don't actualise our directions is because our directions are pulling in very different ways. So you might have somebody, for instance, who, you know, fundamental to them is that desire for relatedness. They really want to be close to someone. You know, the lower order direction towards that is to be in a romantic relationship. And of course, this is just one example. But what happens if somebody's had, as I was talking about earlier, an experience, say, of abuse, and where for them, they want safety, but to be safe means not being intimate. So you've got someone, you know, in a sense, if that was all there was, or if this was all there was, then they would be able to achieve the directions. But the problem for a client here, the person here, is that they really want that relatedness, but as they get closer in relationships, what comes up is actually they feel really unsafe. And that this direction towards safety gets frustrated, but then they get the direction towards safety, and the one towards relatedness gets frustrated towards it. And I think in many of our different models, whether it's a cognitive behavioural model, psychodynamic model, humanistic model, they all in different ways talk about how conflict pulls the person apart such that they experience stress and they can't actually get to the place that they want. In the humanistic model, for instance, we talk about the way that people really want to be approved of. And that's a direction towards approval, to be liked. But also, if we do things to get approved of, it means we don't end up doing other things. Like, you know, Billy Elliot wants to dance, but he's got this conflict because he wants to dance, but he also wants the approval of people. And that makes things difficult for him. There's a nice graphic description of this I just want to show you, of somebody in that kind of conflict about wanting relatedness and safety at the same time. If we have a look at this person over here, and someone comes along and kind of is knocking on the door and saying, "Hi, I'm here," and the person's first reaction towards that kind of invitation towards intimacy behind the wall that they built up for themselves is just threat. It's like, oh my God, somebody's going to get close to me. And that's really scary. So what they do, intelligibly, agentically, but perhaps not for the best of themselves, is they build that wall higher. It's like, bloody hell, you know, I've got to protect myself from a person, and the other person is going to shout around. I'm like, hey, you know, I'm here. But there's a panic in the person. They build a great big wall for themselves, and they've got the safety that they want. They're safe behind that wall, but now they're missing the other thing they want, which is the relatedness and the closeness. And of course, ultimately, that other person goes away, and then they're left on their own, wanting, and that a very unfulfilled direction. And we see that, you know, so often again and again and again in clients is you know, particularly where people have had abuse, trauma, that conflict. And you know, what you have here is somebody acting agentically, intelligibly in the world with the best of intentions. But with the best of intentions, they're ending up scuppering other intentions. It's not that they're not intentional, it's not that somebody's doing something to them. It's that their ways of doing things are configured in such a way that they end up making things more difficult for themselves. So I think that, and often in terms of that kind of conflict, this idea of road goals is very much related to that, which is that we know that these directions, these goals can often operate unconsciously. John Bargh, who's done a lot of research around this, writes, active goals are the units of control over higher mental processes, not the self or individual person. An active goal single-mindedly pursue their agenda independently of whether doing so is in the overall good of the individual person. Sometimes, just going back to that image here, we have goals that don't act in the interest of ourselves as a whole. So in here, it's the person kind of panicking, that desire for safety that takes over the person. Or it might be the person with an alcohol problem, where that desire for oblivion leads them to drink in a way that destroys other facets of their life. It might be when we get really rageful in an argument with our partners and we kind of lash out and we say things that are really destructive. And at that point, that kind of goal has taken over for us. There's a kind of rogue goal that has taken over for us that is single-mindedly pursuing, whether it's kind of justice or righteousness or self-worth, as I was talking about earlier. But the problem is that it's doing it in isolation from all the other different goals in our lives, that it takes us in a place that pulls us away from other things that we want and other things that we're good for, and that we have to spend a lot of time in our lives then trying to salvage and to make the most of the problems and the difficulties that we've had. So one of the reasons that people, so I'm just going to skip over this, but one of the reasons that we might struggle in our lives is because at a deep level, and we're not talking about, you know, if we had more time, I'd love to invite you to think about the goals that you've written down and to think about are they in conflict or not. But we're particularly thinking about the kind of those deep embodied goals and where they sit with other goals and how things in different directions in your life. So that's one thing, and a lot of the psychodynamic is obviously very conflict-based, the models, the humanistic models, CBT model. You know, the CBT model, just before I go on to that, we can understand CBT as cognitive behavioural therapy as talking about the conflicts that come up between short-term goals and long-term goals. Because the short-term goal often, you know, when we think about, so the CBT model would say often the problems that we have are around things like black and white thinking, or seeing things in all or nothing terms, or catastrophizing. And we can understand something like catastrophizing is a very kind of short-term goal. We just, you know, it's easy to see things in black and white terms. So if somebody maybe says something and we're not quite sure what it means, we go, God, they must hate us, because it creates this nice black and white world where everything is very simple. We achieve that short-term goal, But again, it scuppers all the long-term goals that we might have about being able to deal and respond constructively with the world around us. So even with a CBT, we can see that in terms of conflict. But the other thing, and again, where CBT can be very helpful, is because it can help us understand that sometimes the reasons we don't actualise our goals is we're just not very good at doing it. You know, somebody might have a striving for relatedness, and they might think, okay, I'm going to do that by establishing romance. This isn't me, by the way, I should say. But one of the clients I talk about in the book is about a kind of young guy who, you know, he's got his mates, he's quite isolated, but he really wants to have a relationship with a young woman. And how does he get closeness? Well, you know, when he's with his mates, what does he do to get close? He takes the piss out of them, he kind of gets stoned with them, he has fun with them, he's quite boisterous and kind of pushes them and, you know, does things like that. Understandably, if he thinks, okay, how am I going to get close to a woman? He does all those things as well. Doesn't go down very well. And, you know, and why doesn't he do that? You know, in many ways, he just hasn't learned about the world around him and how you do things effectively. And and this is where things like psychoeducation, for instance, in cognitive behavioural therapy, is so helpful. When I was younger, I used to really struggle with, I still do to an extent, around anxiety, for instance, getting panic attacks. I used to get really bad panic attacks when I was younger. And like most people who get panic attacks, I thought that, you know, when you start feeling panicky, the best thing to do is just go, I don't want to have a panic attack, I don't want to have a panic attack, please God, I don't want to have a panic attack. Because you just want to shut it down and you just want to get away from the panic attack. And when I went to therapy at the Maudsley, it was really helpful, because one of the things I learned was that actually the best way of dealing with panic attacks is just go, bring it on. You know, and when you start saying, instead of saying, oh, I won't have a panic attack, start saying, all right, if I'm going to have a panic attack, I'll have a panic attack, it's not going to be the end of the world. Massively changed, you know, the levels of panic. Also, other things about realising, you know, when I used to get panic attacks, oh, I'm going to die, my heart's beating so fast. Learning that actually you didn't need to control that, you know, you weren't going to die, those things. So sometimes kind of learning just how to move towards our goals and how to do that effectively sometimes can also be really helpful, and sometimes we just don't know. And that's where psychoeducation and learning about things can really helpfully come in. What I guess the message there then is, I was saying earlier, is that, you know, I come from a humanistic background, and in the humanistic background, we do really like to hold on to this idea that as human beings, we're always striving to do our best. And I do think that's true. I think, you know, that even when people behave in very destructive ways, generally people are striving to do their best. But striving to do our best doesn't mean that we're always doing the best thing for us. And sometimes, with all the best will in the world, we can end up behaving ways, just like, you know, when I was talking about my panic attack. You know, that seemed like the most sensible thing to do, was to try and shut down that panic. But sometimes striving to do our best isn't always the best thing that we can be doing. And again, if there was time, it would be great to have a bit more time. Just think about those kind of goals that you've got there, and think about, are they in conflict? And then also, do you have the right plans in place? Are you kind of doing them? Are you progressing towards them in effective ways? Maybe something you want to have a think about, what might be the most effective. But I wanted to talk about, and again, I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. What I wanted to talk about, just spend a bit of time, and then we will have some time for reflection on those goals. But something else that's really interesting in the goals literature, and has been worked on by a lot of psychologists, and I've been interested in kind of bringing together, is the idea that it's not just about actualising goals, because there's different kinds of goals. And actually, there's a very famous paper called Not All Goals Are Not Created Equal. That some goals are actually more kind of helpful and more useful to us than other goals. And we can think about what the different dimensions of goals are, and the different kinds of goals that exist. And one of the big distinctions that people make is between approach goals and avoidance goals. So approach goals is where we have a goal to move towards something, like, I'd really like to make more friends, or I'd like to have a more rewarding career. Whereas avoidance goals are the goals where we're trying to stop something happening. So it might be like, I don't want to feel so sad, or I don't want to be so isolated. And what the research tends to show is that where people have a lot of avoidant goals and where their kind of directions are a running away rather than a running towards, that they tend to have lower levels of psychological well-being. And also we know in a therapeutic context that people do less well in therapy when they're working towards avoiding goals. And there's probably a lot of different reasons for that. One is that, when you've got an approach goal, you kind of know when you've got there and you have a sense of satisfaction. Whereas if you've got an avoiding goal about kind of running away from something, you never really feel or know that you've escaped. There's always that thing haunting you. There's never really any end point within an avoiding goal, whereas there is with an approach goal. Probably also approach goals kind of they boost your kind of sense of self-confidence that you can feel good about getting to somewhere. Avoidance goals, what do you feel? Do you feel good that you've avoided something? Maybe you feel safe, but doesn't really boost your confidence, and then that confidence can be really important in terms of moving forward. If you've got an approach goal, then you're pulling into your mind a positive image of where you want to get to. And that kind of reinforces it in a way. If you think about, if I say I want to have more friends, then immediately I'm thinking about being around more friends. And that can boost my kind of sense of hope in that and possibility. If I'm thinking about avoiding isolation, then what that calls to my mind is isolation and that kind of negative side of it. So generally, approach goals seem to be a more positive way forward than avoidance goals. And some of the therapies actually try and help clients think about how can you reframe your goals in terms of approach rather than avoidance. Another very interesting distinction and very much related to well-being is between intrinsic and extrinsic goals. So we might have goals that are very much about what we want for ourselves, and particularly here's ones from Selfdetermination theory about autonomy and meaning. Or they may be very much contingent on the approval of others, that we want to do things because we want other people to like us and approve of us. And what the research shows is that well-being tends to be, so when people, it's true that people feel good when they actualize their goals, but it's only when those goals are intrinsic goals. And there was a very famous study, which I'm sorry isn't more famous, that was about looking at what happens when people move towards extrinsic goals like fame, money, success in careers. And what they found is that when people move towards those goals, they don't feel better. And presumably they don't feel better because in many ways those extrinsic goals, things like fame, are right down at the bottom of the hierarchy, and like lots of different things need to happen to get them to be things that really mean something to us, those higher order goals. Whereas the intrinsic goals are the higher order goals to begin with. And also those extrinsic goals are so dependent on other people's responses. And therefore we don't have control over it in the way that we have over intrinsic goals. So this is very consistent with a kind of humanistic existential worldview, which is about doing things that are intrinsically satisfying. And the research really does support that position. This is just the effect size, which is a kind of magnitude of change, and shows that there's a strong correlation between intrinsic goals and more psychological well-being. We can also think about conscious and unconscious goals, and I've talked quite a lot about that already, but the idea that some of our goals are things that we're very aware of, but research also shows that these goals, even these kind of post-intentional goals, can operate in an unconscious level. And there's studies, for instance, that get people to do word searches, say, where there's lots of cooperative terms in the word search. And then they're asked to do something like a resource sharing game, and it shows that if people have had a lot of competitive words in that word search, they're more likely to be competitive. So all the time is the research that we're aiming often towards goals. That can be at an unconscious level. What's also interesting about that is that the correlation between our conscious goals and our unconscious goals is often very low. So that where they use things like projective tests or get people to tell stories and they interpret where somebody's motivated towards on the basis of that, what they find is that what people say their goals are and what they actually seem to be motivated towards is quite a low association. So that kind of really calls into question the whole thing about, if you say to somebody, what are your goals? How much is somebody really going to be able to articulate that. And actually, certainly therapeutically, and I'll come on to this, that when you're working with goals, you can't just say to somebody, you know, what are your goals? What do you want from this? That it needs dialogue, it needs some unpacking to get a real sense of what somebody's goals are. There is some exceptions to that. For instance, people who are high in self-determination, people who are more body conscious, seem to have more association with their conscious goals, between their conscious and their unconscious goals. But generally, the association is lower than we might imagine. And probably what that means, again, thinking about it therapeutically, is if somebody's goals are very unconscious, that there's lots of rogue goals, they're probably going to be struggling more, and there's probably going to be more psychological distress because they're going to be acting and following and planning in ways that aren't necessarily the ones that have been evaluated as most helpful. Another dimension around goals is specificness versus vagueness. Our goals can be very specific. You know, I want to achieve, I want to lose 6 pounds by next week, or they may be very vague, they may be very open. What we know is that people are more likely to attain specific goals, and that if people set something kind of quite concrete, then those goals tend to be more attained than ones that are kind of vague. And sometimes the problems with goal setting is where people set more vague goals. But at the same time, specific ones might be quite kind of lower order. So this, as I was saying before, the kind of SMART principles about specific and measurable and attainable, that may help people move towards the goals more, but if those aren't the important goals for people, then it may not be so much. Goals can be difficult or they can be easy. And what we know from the research is that people experience more positive effect when they move towards more difficult goals, more challenging goals. And people also tend to perform better when they do more when those goals are more difficult. But at the same time, what we also know is that having realistic goals, and particularly in therapy, can be really important. So difficult goals kind of push people more, and if people set quite aspirational goals, then that can be good in terms of supporting movement. But our ability to attain our goals, or our sense of being able to attain our goals, is always based on our sense of agency. And the problem, the challenge with difficult goals is that if we don't achieve them and we feel kind of worse about ourselves for it, then that might be a backward step. One of the things that we found in our research and talking to clients about goals and moving towards goals is that a lot of clients say that what they really like is having small steps as a behavioural change strategy. And that's there in some of the therapies. Small steps, just setting things that are attainable, that boost your confidence, and then you set another small step and that boosts your confidence and another small step. And that seems to be a very positive cycle for people. Another difference, which I've kind of touched on, is about the difference between outcome goals and process goals. So a goal might be something like, again, it might be, I want to be happy, or I want to have traveled all these countries in the world. But it might also be a goal around, I want to enjoy the process of traveling. And what the research tends to suggest, again, is that whereas outcome goals may be more achievable, that if we have process goals that are about the process, there's more possibility for actualizing those goals on the way. It's not just dependent on where we get to and what our outcomes are, but also about that experience of a positive journey. What I'd like you to do then, and just with the person you were talking to earlier, you were talking about different goals. What I'd like you to do is to go back to the goals and just have a think for, again, about 5 minutes or so, are the goals that you identified at the beginning? And if you didn't do this, I'd just like you to choose 3 goals. And if everybody try and spend a little bit of time talking to somebody. Are your goals approach or avoidant? Are they intrinsic or extrinsic? Are they conscious or unconscious? Well, I guess they're going to have to be conscious to a certain extent. Are they specific or vague? Difficult or easy? Are they process goals or outcome goals? And then what might that say, given what I've been saying about the relationship between different goals and well-being? What might that say about that journey towards those goals and how that might affect you? Okay, just see where you go with that. We've only got a little bit of time, but it might be interesting just to start that. So back with the person you were talking to about those particular goals. So I'd like to talk about this just a bit more practically now in terms of kind of working with goals. And I'm going to talk about it as a therapist, but I guess it'll be relevant to all behaviour change work that we do with people. The handouts, you should have the handouts, or they're certainly all available. And there's a couple of sections in there I'm going to skip over just because of time, but they're about the kind of strengths and the reasons why we might want to work with goals in therapy or where we're working with people. And then some of the challenges and the limitations as well of working with goals. And just to go on to some things around good practice about working with goals. And I guess when we're talking about working with goals with people, we're talking about things like eliciting goals. So inviting clients to think about what their goals might be. Talking about discussing goals. There's also monitoring goals and monitoring how much people attain particular goals that they're striving towards is a different aspect of it. So there's a number of different elements. And in my work, what I would typically do with a client is that I would spend a bit of time at the beginning. So when somebody comes to me for an assessment, we would have an initial meeting and I would just ask them about where they are in their life. And over the first session or first couple of sessions, we gradually begin to formulate some general goals about the work that we're doing together. And in a fairly reflective way, I'll show you a video. I want to have a bit of time to show you a video of myself working, just so you get a sense of how I would practically work with goals in a particular session. But just some kind of general principles that I think are really important in thinking about using goals in therapy. So one is that I think it's really important that clients are offered an opportunity rather than being required to work with goals. And I think that's in any behaviour change. Something we found from our research is that I'd say around probably about 2/3, 3/4 of clients do like goals. They like setting goals for reasons that are in the handout about they give clarity, they help them get clear about what they want, they provide a focus for the work that clients can find very helpful. They help them monitor change. But a number of people we've spoken to, a significant minority, also say they really don't like goals. Sometimes it's because it feels too pressurized. I had one client who said that, you know, if I'm setting goals, I'd only really be doing it for you rather than me. Some people do find it a bit mechanistic, although less than I'd imagined actually. Some feel that there's too much pressure, or that monitoring goals, that if they kind of don't see progress, then it feels quite demoralizing. So I think it's really important that goals should never be something that is expected of clients, but something offered to clients in the work. Second thing is that where we're working with clients around goals, that as I imagine you'd expect, it's something that clients should be very much invited to be part of. We've done some research. A lot of my research has been around asking clients how they would like their therapy to be. And one of the questions we ask is, would you like your therapist to decide for the goals of therapy themselves, or would you like to be included in setting goals for therapy? And you can see here very clearly a very strong majority of clients are saying, I want to be involved in goal setting and be part of that. And that sometimes means that therapists need to put their assumptions to one side. This is from some writers in the States, talking about working with a client and actually having to really listen to the client about what their particular goal was. So they write, Sarah's goal was to be a cheerleader, but her status as a mentally ill residential patient and her daily activity of watching TV and eating snack foods meant that her therapist could not accept this. The therapy floundered until the therapist started to accept and engage more in Sarah's explicitly stated goal. And as they started to talk more about cheerleading and watch cheerleading contests on TV, the interactions became more vibrant and Sarah took a more active role in her community, organising a cheerleading squad for the local basketball team. So what they were saying, and they write about this very eloquently, Barry Duncan and people, is that sometimes as therapists, as professionals, we're surprised by clients' goals, but it's always important to engage with them. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we just, when I'm working with a client, I don't just go, okay, that's your goal, great, let's do that. It's also very important to involve ourselves. And clients say that they do want their therapist to be involved in that goal setting and that goal discussion process, that they often value having somebody who can suggest different alternatives. One client I spoke to said, it was really good having a therapist who said, well, we could strive for this, or you could strive for that, or you could strive for that. What makes sense for you? Generally, what we find in our research on shared decision making is that clients really want to be presented with options rather than a blank slate. Somebody saying, what do you want, is often not a very helpful question. Somebody saying, well, I wonder if this would be useful or this would be useful, seems to be a much more helpful way forward. So clients see therapists as having an important role, listening, eliciting, guiding, Helping clients to stay on track is also really important. And you know, when we ask clients about their preferences in therapy, a lot of clients say, and this really surprised me, one of the questions is, do you want your therapist to listen and not interrupt, or do you want them to interrupt you? And I thought most clients would say, I just want to be listened to. And actually a lot of clients say, I want to be interrupted. I want you to tell me to shut up and come back. Well, not literally shut up, but I want you to tell me to, and bring me my focus back. I know a lot of clients, an amazing amount of clients say, you know, I know I can tend to drift off and go off topic, and I want you to bring me back and to remind me of what our goals are. So clients were saying sometimes that it was helpful to have a therapist who would say, well, what about this? And that they could then modify that. So there's lots of good questions that therapists can ask about goals. For instance, things like, what did you hope would be different from coming here or this conversation? What did you want to change about your life? One that I ask a lot would be, where would you like to be by the end of therapy, or by the end of our work together, or by the end of our conversation, if it's a conversation? How will you know that counselling has been helpful? What would a future look like without the problem? What one word would you use to describe what you want from therapy? There are all different kind of ways of asking the same question, really, is what do you want? But for me personally, you know, the one that I tend to say more than anything else is, okay, so let's imagine we work for 24 weeks together, and where would you like to be? What would be a good place to be by the end of that? And setting kind of realistic goals, as I was talking about earlier, is often very important. Also, in terms of the therapist's input, that it's important that therapists can challenge clients' goals. This is a colleague of mine, Duncan Law, who's done a lot of work around goals with young people. And if you look at his website, Duncan Law, he's got lots of materials that you can use to look at goals with young people. And this is a video that he's got, which is about working with a young woman who's got an eating disorder. It's an actor, obviously, for a public video. And he says to her, basically, it's a very interesting piece of work where he basically says to her, look, I know you want to lose weight, but let's think about goals that, he says, I know you want to lose weight, but I feel that your weight is too low, your parents feel your weight is too low. I'm not willing, basically, to work with you on that goal. Let's think about what that goal is about trying to achieve. What's the higher order goal, like, for instance, having more friends? And let's think about how we can work towards that. So I think working with goals, it doesn't mean that as therapists we need to put what we think is important to one side. Something a lot of clients say to us is that goal setting needs time, and they feel that they don't want it to be rushed. We're in our clinic, we tended to set goals at the beginning of our work together, but clients were saying, well, sometimes I need a few sessions to think about it. Particularly for clients who haven't been in therapy before, to be asked, what are your goals, can be quite not a difficult question, but something that can feel a bit abrupt, and having a bit more time on that can be important. And also that the goal is a kind of ongoing dialogical process. So this is, for instance, me, actually, sorry, I'm going to skip this because I'll show you a video that's much more interesting than me reading that. Also, what our clients talk about is the importance of flexibility. So most clients said that they wanted to be able to set goals, and they like the idea of having goals for therapy, but also that if they came in one week, for instance, and they'd had a really bad week, or they'd had an argument with their boss, that they didn't want the therapist saying, well, okay, come on, we've got to work on these goals. They wanted a therapist who'd allow them to be flexible and revise that. One client said, if I don't feel like talking about these goals, then it's good. We could talk about something else, which is not part of my 3 goals and still has an impact. So I really enjoy that. I don't understand this, actually. So I really enjoy that philosophical, hypothetical debate about, am I a bear? I think it's deeper and it's more profound. I'd love to know what that conversation was about. Am I a bear? But obviously that at the time was more important than those goals, and good for them for going off. And it was important the therapist could do that. And then the other thing I think is that another bit of good practice is, and this is much more unexplored, is that thinking about how can we help clients set goals that actually are the most helpful ones for them. And that goes back to what I was saying about, for instance, approach goals. And I think, we often think about SMART goals, but whether it's coaching, psychotherapy, any kind of therapeutic work, it's really important to remember that SMART goals may be good for achieving those particular goals, but if those goals aren't helpful goals in the first place, if they're extrinsic goals, if they're avoiding goals, then that may not necessarily be helpful for the person. I was dying to come up with a brilliant acronym rather than SMART. I spent 8, you know, they have these acronym makers. I spent 8, Heels Crisps. Maybe somebody can come up with something better, I hope to, but just don't copyright it and say you came up with that. But yeah, something about higher order, helping when clients think about goals, something that's higher order that they really want, something that's effective, so something that's going to help them and there's a clear link to where that's going to get them. Something approach, I think, is the clearest of all of these. Something that's longer term, although at the same time, longer term in a sense, it's a movement towards something longer term, but also I think the small step seems to be really important. Something that's synergistic in the sense that the goals are kind of working together, challenging but realistic, intrinsic. Process focus, I think, is probably important. I suspect where clients have very outcome focused goals, it isn't that helpful, but specific enough to help them move in that direction. So just remember, Heels Crisps as the takeaway message. All right. And just the last thing then is about, and again, sorry, I'm just going to skip forward a bit, but it's just about, there are different ways, and one of the pieces of research we did recently was about using something that we developed called the goals form, which was a way of helping clients just jot down, and this is all freely available, you can just get it from the internet or look on my site mickcooper.co.uk and mick-cooper.co.uk, and you can download all this. And that's just a very simple form that we use that clients can, to write down clients' goals, and then we put it electronically on a form and then we print it off each week, and clients can change goals if they want. But essentially it's a way of tracking goals as the work progresses, and it's fairly easy to revise. And I just wanted to show you, just finally, a short video of working with a client.
I'm sure it's a good thing, it might be quite peaceful, quite nice, but...
So this is working with a client in our clinic at the University of Roehampton. And just to give you an example of how I would work, and you know, it's not a superb piece of work or anything, but just to give you an idea of how I would work. You can't see that, can you? I just realised, let me do it this way. Would work with goals with a client. And hopefully you'll see it's fairly gentle, but comes around to starting to think about goals. Is it working? So hi Aaron, nice to see you here. Thanks a lot for coming along. So we've got some time today just to talk about what's been going on for you and how things are, and just to start thinking about whether this is it would be useful for you to kind of work here, whether this is something you can get something out of, whether we feel that we can help you. Maybe just to start with, it'd be good just to get a sense of what's brought you here and what's been going on.
Well, the main kind of reason is really, I was first brought here, or thought about coming here because of the whole sleep thing. It started off just me not being able to sleep at all, really. Maybe I might get an hour or two, but I'll soon wake up. Right. And then my mood started to sink, and people started to notice it and tell me, like, you know, you're not yourself. I started to be quite irritable with the people that I love the most. And really after they were quite good. After talking to them quite openly about it, they just said, you know, it's probably time to talk to someone about that sort of stuff and actually try and get a handle on stuff. So, okay.
So it feels like the main thing that's kind of brought you here is around sleep.
Yeah, that's the first thing I noticed. Yeah.
So do you have any sense of what's going on there, or what that's about? That's 1 hour sleep, wow, that's not much, is it?
No, it's actually really hard sometimes. Yeah, especially when I've got to get up in the morning for work, and then, you know, maybe if I've got somewhere to go in the evening, you know, it's really hard. So most of the time I just say, I don't want to come because I'm just too drained, really, to bother.
So what happens? Tell me about sleep and what happened.
Well, I go to bed quite late as well. And when I do, I just end up just lying there, just not even necessarily thinking, just staring. And I just can't seem to switch off. And then by the time I'm so exhausted that I force myself to switch off, I just, it feels like I've just woken up again, like I haven't even been to sleep. And I don't really...
So you get into bed and
understand.
you're lying there for hours, it sounds like.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, it started off as a bit of a joke. So like a year ago, I got a birthday present of, you know, here's a book to write stuff down when you can't sleep and things like that. But it is just that. It's lying in bed, staring at a wall.
Yeah. And what goes on for you? Is it unpleasant or it's just nothing? Or frustrating?
Yeah, it's nothing. It's kind of just apathy, really.
So just kind of, you're not anxious. You're just lying there.
Not really. No. It's during the day where I'm just kind of quite nervous and pretty much shook about most stuff, really. But it's at night when I'm in that kind of zoned out state, it kind of goes. I'm not sure if it's a good thing. It might be quite peaceful, quite nice, but it's almost like a break. It feels like, but I know that's not right, because you shouldn't. Well, there should be either good or bad. Surely you shouldn't just feel nothing.
Right. But it is a kind of nothing feeling, but just not possible to sleep.
Yeah, just nothing continuously.
Okay. So we're kind of going to think about kind of working together.
Okay.
Then it sounds like one of the main, and we thought about kind of what you wanted to get out of it. It sounds like one of the main things would be about having where would you want to get to with your sleep? Where would you want to be, like in 12 weeks' time or something, by the time you're finished?
I would like to not be scared of when it's time to go to sleep, because I'd like to know that I'm, you know, like a normal person. I'm going to bed to get a good night's sleep, to get up and do stuff in the morning. So I'm not scared to go to sleep, and therefore scared to wake up, and therefore scared to carry on.
Okay.
It's just cut that chain.
Okay. So say a bit more about that kind of fear of going to sleep.
Well, because it's been so long now, it's just. I know that as soon as I'm at my desk, I'll turn the computer off, I'll turn my phone off, and I know that that's when it starts kicking in. It's like I know that as soon as I go into that bed, that's it for the next few hours. It feels like almost like a waste of time. That, you know, if I know I'm only getting an hour's sleep anyway, what's the point in going there?
Yeah. So what is it you'd like to change? Would you like to change like how you feel about it, or would the main change be actually getting more sleep? You know, we were kind of 12 weeks time ahead. Would the ideal be that you were getting 8 hours of sleep, or actually is that less important than how you're feeling about it, and you know that you're feeling more positive, you're feeling less anxious about going to sleep? Yeah,
like I want to go to bed. I know it sounds weird, but I know that if I want to go to bed, then even if I do get an hour's sleep and I'm still tired, then at least I won't be in that awful place. I know that the next day I might not feel as bad because I haven't just had 5-6 hours of just blank. If that makes any
it does,
sense.
It does make sense. So it sounds like kind of, you know, do you mind if I just write some, jot some of this down? And then, because what we can do, if it's okay, and if it would be helpful for you, is just kind of jot down some goals. And then we can, kind of track it over time and just see how that goes. And
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Yeah.
So it sounds like a first one might be something around, what would it be? How would you word it? Would it be something like to feel okay about going to sleep? To not be worried about going to sleep?
To feel good about it.
To feel good.
I think that's kind of the key part. It's not to worry, because you know that might still be there, but to actually feel the good part about it.
Okay. So something about feeling good about it. So if we were kind of further down the line, and you were actually feeling quite good about going to sleep and maybe looking forward to it, and feeling that was quite a positive thing. Whereas at the moment, it sounds like it's something that you're quite worried about, or more of a negative thing.
Yeah.
then that would be a kind of good outcome for the work. Yeah. If you're interested in that, the video's on my website, and again, just publicly accessible. And you can see that we talk about that, and we talk about that a bit more, and then the other goals comes up, and that gets more contextualized. But I just want to show you that in terms of, I guess, thinking about goals, and maybe as a kind of take-home message about that when we're thinking about goals, having that time to talk with clients and talk with people about it, and allow the deeper meanings to come through, rather than just, I'm sure if I'd asked him what his goals were there at the beginning, something very different might have come out and perhaps been less meaningful for him. So I'm aware we've just got a few minutes. I'm sorry there isn't much time for questions, but hopefully you did have some time to kind of interact and think about it. Do we have some questions before we finish, or comments? Yeah. Yeah, please.
I'm a psychiatric occupational therapist, and we just constantly, all we do is work with goals, but this has been a much richer way of looking at goals.
Thank you.
And I just wondered if you had any dialogue with OT as a profession in terms of the way that you're working with goals and the way that we are.
I haven't, no, but...
So it would be incredibly beneficial to do some MDT work around that. And
Right. It sounds like from what you're saying that you find it a bit frustrating, just goal, goal, goal. Is it? No?
No, it's fine. I mean,
It's fine.
It's not bread and butter. It's what we do. But I think that's given me some ideas for example, when you're a bit stuck and the goal doesn't seem to be working, we always work on the sticking point and then grade it. So we do the thing of breaking it down to small steps and finding out which is the next appropriate step. But in terms of routing it back to the higher order goal, is something that I think is really useful. So helping the person we're working with locate that in a really person-centered way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know, I think it'd be worth, I know I would have really appreciated it in my training, going into that level of depth around why people choose their goals.
Right, thank you, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, just affirming what you were saying earlier, if I've got it right, is about growth. And I've found that the most meaningful times of me when I've been in a state of growth that's been approved to me, like if I've done something and suddenly I've got a realization that moves me forward in any direction, I get a real happy moment.
Yeah.
And so long as I'm on that state of continuous growth and proof that I'm growing, doesn't matter where to, but I've got a general idea of direction.
Yeah.
It is so meaningful, and it gives me a real sense of joy.
Yeah, I think so the comment was about kind of the joy and that pleasure in having that sense of growth and movement. And I think that's really what that notion of directionality is that kind of movement forward. And that if we feel that movement forward is happening rather than blocked and kind of damned, that's a kind of good life. Yeah.
When you talked about process goals, that was good for me, because I realised my goals are mainly outcome goals. I focus a lot on the outcome, and then I think sometimes I forget to enjoy the process. And of course, if you've got goals that can be long term, sometimes you can break it to baby steps and small chunks. But still, sometimes I think it feels like when I do my goals, I think it feels more like a struggle than. Have you got any tips for enjoying the process?
It's a tough one, isn't it, actually? Because in a way, if you said it, you know, if you say, right, my goal is going to be enjoy the process, it becomes a bit of a kind of outcome process goal, doesn't it? And I guess the question would be, do you enjoy the process? I mean, do you need to be conscious of enjoying it? Or, you know, if you said it kind of explicit, would that actually kind of get in the way of it? Or could you allow yourself just to be there? Is it enjoyable? I guess that would be my first question to you, would be, is it enjoyable to be striving towards those outcome goals? Or do you find that you just get very focused on the end point and actually don't really enjoy it along the way?
Yeah, I think that's more my tendency. I mean, it depends. There's some things where I enjoy doing it, but then in those things it is more about the process rather than so much the goal. But there are some things you say about challenging, and take on a challenging goal, but then you often get difficult. It's a struggle, and I'm like, part of me doesn't want to do it, and I do.
Yeah.
It'd be much nicer if I could enjoy those things on the journey rather than the journey just being tough.
I think that's I actually think that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, because if you could find answers to that and how people could do that, I think therapeutically that would be beneficial to loads of people, really. you know, where we get stuck on outcomes and actually, you know, whether it's about trying to work out in a situation. I guess, you know, some people would say it's about trying to work out in a situation what is pleasurable or what is meaningful in that situation per se, and being able to focus on that. But I think it's a really good question. Yeah.
So when you actually think about basically the goals and then all those steps, so emergence, awareness, evaluation, intention, planning, and then action itself. So what I could say that, for example, I'm a perfect example of a person who's overanalyzing always everything, and I actually get stuck in the planning step of the actual goal. So I plan everything. I haven't had problems with any, like, you know, previous steps. But I plan everything in like little detail. So it's like I have crystal clear everything I want to do and achieve. And then it comes to action. Like for the first maybe a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I'm motivated and I just lose motivation. And I mean, it's just what kind of advice would you actually give?
Oh, wow. I think you're going to get the same answer. That's a great question.
Can you clarify the question for me?
Yeah, sorry. So the question was about if you get really stuck on planning and you're really good at planning, but then you get motivated and then you lose motivation when you get going. And why is it you lose motivation? Is it just not, is the planning more interesting than the doing? Maybe. Yeah, it'd be interesting to explore that more about what is it that, why does that motivation? But yeah, maybe it is that the pleasure is actually in the planning. And
I do know that the actual intrinsic motivation is very strong. So, you know, with emergence and with like awareness, I know this is really something that is really important for me. But when it comes to the actual action, it's always, you know, oh, we live in London, it's very busy, it's very hard to find the time.
yeah.
All these kind of, you know, kind of things that I justify myself with, whereas I'm quite aware of doing all this. So.
One of the nice things in the research, actually, there's a lot of research about something called implementation intentions, and that's about if-then plans when things go wrong. And what the research shows is that where you're helping people towards goals, having plans for where they get interrupted is really important. So it's not just about the positive things, it's about, you know, like if this happens, like if I think, oh, it's really difficult to get around London, what are you going to do then to make the goal happen? And one of the really nice things about this area is just how the psychology and the therapy come together. But I'm aware we need to finish there, so thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a great afternoon.